All right, I think we are live. No countdown this time, apparently. Uh, Today we have a very special episode, episode 9 of Sigmar's Symposium. This was scheduled for a year ago, but I had some health problems that took me out of the game for a while. But I'm back, I'm doing a lot better, and I have a very special guest for you all. So, Aodhan MacMhaolain, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Magnus. I'm Aodhan MacMhaolain. I'm a folk builder with the Ossature Folk Assembly. I'm also a poet and a musician, and I have a Substack that I run. And I'm really happy to be here to talk about Celtic mythology.
Sounds good with me. So we're going to be getting into Celtic mythology and Indo-European history in this episode. And the first question I have for you, Aodhan, diving straight into it, is could you describe the Celtic religion for the audience who may not be familiar with it? Because I'm sure most are familiar with the Norse pantheon, the Hellenic pantheon, but not as much attention gets given to the Celtic. So feel free to take it from there.
Okay, so the Celts, just to kind of go into a bit of their history, they are from the same Proto-Indo-European horizon. They are Indo-Europeans. They have a deep connection to the Central European cultures of the Late Bronze Age, known as the Urnfield culture and the Hallstatt culture and the Unatice culture, and then really the one that we associate with the actual Celts themselves would be the Latene culture. And these are all largely Central European cultures, and they also have a pretty strong connection to the Bell-Beakers, who are a westward expansion of the corded ware. And the corded ware are ancestral to many Northern Europeans and Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans and Indo-Aryans. I mean, the corded ware were pretty central to the spread of Indo-Europeans, and the Bell-Beakers are an expansion upon that. They have the Bell-Beakers. I mean, they have a relation to a refugia of. And refugia is like where a genetic population kind of sees a return. They go through a big drop, and maybe they've had some economic or environmental or maybe civil disasters, and they go through a fertility drop, or they die out, or a lot of them die, and then they come back though, and they experience what's known as a refugia. And so there was a refugia of early European farmers who had mixed with the Western hunter-gatherers, and you get some Western hunter-gatherer refugia coming up out of the bogs of North Central Europe. And some of these people are associated with the spread of the Bell-Beakers. And the Bell-Beakers, they dominated Western Europe, and you can kind of see a progression, a development coming up out of the Rhine, out of Central Europe, of the Bell-Beakers, their strongholds there in Central Europe. You can see a progression from the Bell-Beakers going into the Unatice culture, going into the Hallstatt culture, and then going into the Latene culture. And that's really where the development of what we associate, what we call the Celts. Now, when I say the Celts, I'm mostly talking about a cultural and linguistic group, not necessarily talking about a purely genetic group, because there's different lines, on that family, and the very early Proto-Germans also have a lot of Unetice and Bell-Beaker, haplogroups and cultural adoptions, you might say, or it's a part of the development of many Europeans, not just the Celts. And when you finally do get Celtic culture, it really just kind of spreads. There are genetic expansions, there are migrations, conquests, and things of that nature that spreads Celtic culture, but it's not as widespread as people think. It's mostly a cultural expansion. It was the stylish thing to do. There was a lot of there's a lot of writing from different scholars talking about how prior to the Roman civilization, In Europe, especially Western Europe and Central Europe, the Celts were seen as the civilized force. They were the wealthy people. They controlled a lot of gold mines. They controlled the tin mines of Cornwall. They controlled a lot of salt mines. That was a really big thing with salt. And so they were very, very wealthy, and their culture would have just been seen as stylish. So with that in mind, keeping in mind that they are not necessarily a genetic group, they're just a cultural group and linguistic family, it makes it a little bit difficult to just talk about Celtic mythology, because what we associate with the Celts are groups like the Gauls of France or the Britons, the pre-Anglo-Saxon Britons, who are now, the best example of them today are the Welsh. Or we think about the Gaels of Ireland. These are all different groups, and they definitely share, similarity in their culture. They share similarity in their mythology and in their gods, but it's not all the exact same. There's actually some pretty big differences from the Gauls as compared to the Gaels. They have some pretty significant differences in the way that they, formulated their mythology. And we don't actually have a lot of Gallic mythology. It does exist, and there's a lot of study on it that I'm currently going through. But that's a more I wouldn't say fringe, but it's criminally understudied. There's a lot of stuff that people just haven't thought about, like place names, etymological research, linguistics, things of that nature. And there's this great scholar that I'll kind of be mentioning here and there, Olmsted. I forget his first name, but Olmsted has written a large amount of works that are pretty groundbreaking in how you should be viewing Gallic mythology as compared to Gaelic, because there are some stark similarities, but there's also some stark differences. So with all that in mind, mostly I will be talking about the Gaelic mythology and the Gaelic gods, because not only is that my patronym, and I'm of partial Gaelic descent, but it's also because it's the best understood out of all of the Celtic mythologies. And I'll just kind of relate it to the Gallic, or maybe bring up an interesting tidbit. But yeah, so in the Gaelic mythology, the pantheon are known as the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha De Danann are the divine tribe, the tribe of the gods, also known as the folk of the goddess Danu. And Danu is a goddess of the land. She's a personification of Ireland in many cases. She has a part of her a tripartite system, and tripartites are very important. That's where there's three gods or goddesses wrapped up into one domain, or sometimes even three angles, depictions, or sides to the same god or goddess. And you'll see tripartites all throughout the Tuatha De Danann. You also see it a lot in Gaul. There's a lot of tripartites in Gaul as well. And these tripartite systems they're Indo-European for sure, but there's some argument and debate about how much you should really read into the tripartites of different Indo-Europeans. I forget the scholar, but one of them, he was always seeing three into everything. And so there's been some debate on, are there really always so many tripartites? But when it comes to the Celtic, especially with the Gaelic, there's a lot of tripartites. One of the best examples would be the Morrigan, who is the Great Queen or the Phantom Queen. And she's a goddess of fate, warfare, and she's a consort with the Allfather, who's known as the Daga, who is the great god of druids, also known as the good god, or Yochu Olather, which means the horse Allfather. And the Dagda is, a consort of the Morrigan, and the Morrigan has within her three aspects or three goddesses who make up the Morrigan. Different ways that you can view that. The Dagda himself is a part of a tripartite of the three high kings. You have the Dagda, you have Nuada, and you have Lu. And you also have the Tri Dedana, who are the three gods of craft. And so there's a lot of tripartites going on in the Celtic pantheon. And the mythology itself is largely based around arrival of the divine tribe and their war with the, you might say, the destructive powers or the more chaotic powers known as the Fomorians. These are more closely related to maybe Titans or Jotnar than they are to, like in the Norse mythology, they have the Jotnar, who are the evil giants, but they also have the Vanir, who are like, the more nature gods. And the Aesir and the Vanir, they have some sort of war, some sort of conflict, and then they come together and they come into unity together as one tribe, and they go to war against the Jotnar. Well, in the Irish, the Fomorians do kind of play the role of the Jotnar, of these evil, wicked giants who, have to be fought against. But you also find that, just like how in the Norse, sometimes a Jotnar and an Aesir might have a child, like Loki or Thor. But you also see that in Irish, where the Fomorians and the Tuatha will sometimes have children together. And there are some Fomorians who do kind of read more like a Vanir than like a Jotnar. So there's not as much of a division there, but it's definitely the Fomorians are the enemies of the gods. They're the rivals of the gods of the Tuatha. And after arriving to Ireland and doing battle with the Fomorians, eventually the Gaels come to Ireland, and they don't really do battle with the Tuatha, but they definitely drive them underground into the hills, into the barrows, into the mounds, where they become the Fey folk. And we don't know how much of that would have been exactly a traditional view, because within the sagas and myths that we have, it's pretty obvious that the Gaels, when they show up to Ireland, are actually first interacting with the Tuatha almost on even footing. And the Tuatha will give guidance to the Gaels, or they'll intermarry with the Gaels and give birth to, the lineages and the clans, the great chieftain and kingly lineages which lead these clans. A lot of clans claim descent from a god itself. You see this also in Gaul, where they will straight up say that they come from a god like Tutates, who is a god of the tribe. That's what Tuta means, same as Tuatha. All of these words are cognate with Teuton, that Germanic word for tribe. So there's really not a lot of, there's not a lot of, I don't want to say cosmology, because that's not true. There is some cosmology, but there's no clear cut, here's the cosmology, and here's the totally pre-Christian view that the Gaels or the Celts would have had. We are missing a good chunk, but we do have a lot. So they would have seen the naming of the land to be an act of creation. The division of the land would have come from a god, and that division would have relayed directly to human men. And definitely men, our race, the Gaels and the Celts and stuff, they would have viewed themselves as being descended from these gods. So literally like kindred, of a lesser tuoth, you might say. And so there's really there's a lot of similarities between the Norse and the Celts. There's there is a world tree that's depicted in the Celtic conception that oftentimes goes over people's heads, because it's just in a couple of one-off sagas that the Irish have. But they did conceive of a world tree. One of the main differences, though, is that, especially for the Irish, Ireland was seen as the center of the world. Ireland was the axis mundi of the world. And in the center of Ireland, it's not really the center, but they call it the center, is the Newgrange. It's a giant mound complex, burial complex, and at this complex is a stone known as the Lia Feo, and it's the I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's like the it's the stone of destiny. It's the axis mundi. It's a stone, it's a pillar, and it's supposed to represent the axis mundi of itself. Ireland houses the axis mundi of the world, and the Lia Feo is the axis mundi. So there's a little bit of differences between how they might have viewed all of these things in terms of the world tree as compared to the Norse or the Leothale. There's sacred trees and wells all over Ireland. These wells oftentimes weren't exactly wells, but that's what they would call them. They might have just been a pool of water or, a lake or something, a loch. But oftentimes these pools and these wells and these trees are also seen as being liminal spaces tied to the axis mundi. They have access to the other world, similar to the mounds and barrows. And all of this is pretty starkly seen in the Irish. You don't really get a lot of deeper insight into the Gaelic, but it does exist. And one of the key differences that I should note before I hand it back to you is that the Gaelic religion, the more continental Celtic religion, has a innumerous amount of regional cults. You see this all over the place. You have the three mothers, the matres, which are probably related to the Morrigan. You have Carnunos, the horned god. You have the sky god, Tyrannus. You have the horse goddess, Epona. Epona is one of the few ones who would have been worshipped all over. Well, really, all of these ones that I just mentioned would have been worshipped all over. But in terms of the local cults, I mean, an innumerable amount of these local cults, and this definitely is tied to this concept known as the genius loci, which is I think that's Greek, might be Latin. I think it might be Latin, but it's the governing spirit of a place, the governing spirit of an environment, of an area, of a tree, of a cave, of a hill. And so these would have been seen as a part of the divine pantheon. And there's just so many of them. You do get this a little bit in the Irish and the Welsh and stuff, but oftentimes those gods are better described, and we just know more about them. So, another thing is that oftentimes male and female deities they are pretty much often married, and because of this, it kind of makes it easy for us to sometimes identify them in a comparative mythological sense, because the marriage of two gods together, it helps us identify them. A great example would probably be the Daga being the consort of different goddesses, and that allows us to know where these goddesses rest within the hierarchy, and it lets us know where the Daga rests in the hierarchy. But before I hand it off, I'll just reiterate again that in the Irish, we know more about the pantheon, we know more about the mythology. There's just a lot more written down. Same with the Welsh to a degree, but we just don't know as much about the Gaelic, even if we do have a large amount of material to go through. There's written material from the Romans and Greeks, and there's a lot of inscriptions that people just don't know about.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for anyone who may not have been familiar with Celtic mythology. And there are several things there. I like how you touched on the similarities and differences between the Celtic and Germanic pantheons. The Fomorians sound a lot really similar to the Jotun. They're kind of the antagonists compared to the divine tribe, which resembles the Aesir. And you also mentioned the world tree, of course. So the next question I have for you is, do you feel drawn to any particular gods or goddesses more than any others? Because I can share this personally. I feel particularly drawn to the gods Frey and Freya, the Vanir in Asatru. So yeah, are there any specific gods who call to you more than the others?
When it comes to the Gallic tradition, yes, there's Cernunnos, the horned god. He is filled with great mystery. He's probably more than any of the other gods of the Gauls. I'm very interested in him. He's always depicted with a torque around his neck, holding a torque, holding a snake, oftentimes with animals all around him. And he's depicted on the Gundestrup cauldron, which is a really awesome cauldron that was found in, I believe, Denmark. and it's covered with Celtic gods and goddesses, and shows the rebirth of soldiers being dipped into a cauldron to be rebirthed and reincarnated. And Cernunnos is definitely tied to that in some way. There's a lot of theories about who he is in Gaelic religion. I relate him mostly to the Daga, although that's probably not correct. That's just kind of how I view it. There's definitely other comparisons that people make. He's very interesting because his cult it largely survived. It largely survived Romanization. It was one of those cults that was adopted into the Romans. There's a lot of Gallic gods that got adopted in. Most of the times they're compared to some other god, like a good example would probably be Mercury. They would do that often, or Jupiter. They do that often. Kaiser said that the Gauls worshipped this underworld deity known as Dis Pater, who's clearly the Sky Father, and he's probably also related to the Daga. But there's no Dis Pater that we can really find in their mythology. What we find is more Cernunnos. He's the most widespread god out of all of them, and there's just something mysterious about him. He kind of reminds me of Herne the Hunter, that depiction, the Anglo-Saxon depiction of Odin in the Wild Hunt. He reminds me of that, and definitely the torque and the torques that he's holding must relate to oathing in some sense. Torques were definitely seen as being tied to oathing. It said that there's I think it was Irish. There's an Irish saga that says that if you spoke a lie while you're wearing a torque, then it would tighten around your neck and choke you. And so the torque is tied to oathing and to gifts, the gifts given by a regent, and it's also tied to inheritance. You would inherit torques from your fathers, and they would be seen tied to weddings as well. You would receive a torque upon your wedding, and so Cernunnos is tied to a lot of things that are very fundamental to human life, and he's just got a mystery to him, a lot like Odin. And then with the Gaelic pantheon, definitely the one that I've always been drawn to is Lu Lamfada. He is the youthful champion. Lu of the long arm, he is called, the long arm of the law, and he is also tied to oathing. He's tied to the young warrior bands. The Fianna is the Gaelic version of the Mannerbund. And Lu is sometimes comparative mythologists like to compare him to Odin, and other times they like to compare him to Thor. And I think that he is kind of like an Odinic Thor, you might say. He has Odinic qualities to him, being tied to the Mannerbund, but he's also clearly the champion, the striking champion. Both Lu and the Daga have clubs. The Daga's club, if he hits you with it, you die, and then he hits you with it again, and you're reborn, which links the Daga to reincarnation and the underworld being kind of like a chthonic skyfather. And then Lu is, his club is just linked more to thunder, to striking. He also has a spear, a very famous spear. So Lu is definitely the one that I'm drawn to in the Gaelic, and Cernunnos is the one that I'm drawn to in the Gallic.
Very interesting. Now I'd like to pivot to the moral teachings of the Celtic religions. In Asatru, obviously, we have the principle of folkism. That's very important. And we also have the principle of protecting our women. And I know there are some similarities with Celtic mythology in this regard. So can you explain the role of folkism in the Celtic religions, and also what moral teachings does Celtic mythology provide?
So the folkism, it obviously has a very strong Germanic modern revival about it, tied up with it. We can really, thank the Volkish movement for getting that off the ground. But the Celts themselves, especially the Irish, are a great example, or the Welsh as well. They have a great folkish bent that they've just kind of had all throughout Christianity. And a lot of it has to do with paternalism and patriarchy and, the clan system. Definitely, the ancient kin is a version that's, the Germanic version that's tied to clan, or the ancient gens of the Mediterraneans. That's another term that's tied to clan, although clan comes from a different etymological root. Clan comes from a root that basically means to plant, and you do kind of see this though with some Latin terms, that basically, like means like the plant of some family, the clan of some family, the growing root of some family. And a lot of Europeans lost their kin system, their gens system earlier than the Celts. The Celts kept that going. The Gaels in particular kept that going until the 17th, 18th centuries, and remnants of it exist today, even if it has no state power. And so, folkism is definitely something that's very tied to clanism for the Celts. It's something that's tied to tribalism. A great example, again, would be this god Tutatis. He's a Gallic god, and he means the god of the tribe. And he's literally the god of the tribe. He's the one that's in charge of the tribe. That's his domain, is the Tuath, the Tuta. And he's related to, I'm forgetting the name. There's a Proto-Indo-European god that they like to relate him to, which you also see with the depiction of Erdman, who might be kind of like an Odinic figure. And definitely this is all tied to this concept of paternalism, meaning that, this is the God that you come from. This is the God that you hail. And so because of that, your father, your house father, and your ancestor, your divine ancestor are intimately connected in a kind of in a reincarnational sense. So there's this quote, and it basically goes, I swear by the gods that my fathers swear by. And that is the baseline of Celtic folkism. And so it's definitely something that is deeply tied to the clan. And I think that you see this pretty strongly with the Irish and the Scots, even and the Welsh, even though they had Christianized, even though they had lost a lot of state power, they still maintained a very, very strong clannish system. And this is all due to the household cult that they had, which was really, and for them, it was really more of a clannish cult.
Very interesting. And the next thing I want to talk about is poetry and the role of bards in Celtic society. You talk about this in the introduction to your book, Poetry for the Folkish, which I highly recommend. And I think it's really fascinating that pretty much every king in Ireland and Scotland also had a court poet in his service. So can you explain the importance of poetry and bards, not just culturally, but also politically in these societies?
Yeah. So the bard is incredibly important for the Celts. It's very similar to the skald for the Norse, but in terms of the Celtic, especially the Gaelic, the bard was the glue that held the clan together, and definitely was kind of like a even prior to written writing, the bard would have been seen as the literati. They would have been seen as the elite knowledge holding class. When the Druids began to disappear and convert and die out and everything, the bards really stepped up and became the new spiritual leaders, almost sometimes in tandem with monks and working with monks, or they would be a monk, or they would continue in a special position within the kingdom, within the tribe, within the clan. And there's so many different ranks and grades of the bards. There's not just the one position. The term "people of the arts," which in Gaelic is Eos Dana, which is tied to the Eos She, or the Tuatha De Danann. It's a class of people. It's a specific class of people, And they would have been advisors, they would have been genealogists, they would have been storytellers. They were expected to memorize and recite family trees. And when you get literati, when you get the writing, when everyone's literate now, you start to see them writing down a lot, so much. They wrote down so much, and it was very complex. The Ogam, which is the writing script that the Gaels had come up with, which was probably tied to Proto-Celtic more than anything. Probably existed outside of Ireland, but we really only have attestations to it in Ireland and Scotland. But the Ogham script, there's so many different types of it, and there's all different ways to write it because the bards were so prolific in writing, not just in Latin, but also in the native Ogham script. And there's just so many different types of them. I mean, you would call them a fili, which is the actual position, but then there's the olav, which is the highest, they're one of the master classes. And there would have been so many different ranks going from the very top, from the olav, who would have been seen as almost embodying the ancient poet Avergan, or maybe Fintan MacBochra, who themselves might be demigods. We're not exactly sure about Fintan, but Avergan is pretty, people do like to, associate him with the gods themselves because he was so famous, because he had done such a great job with his bardic knowledge that he was almost deified. So bards were seen as very, very important. Not always even because they were just like a very strong group of people, or because they had all this knowledge, but also because they had legal protections. They could do satire, which was heavily curtailed so that they couldn't, satire was something that was heavily, heavily regulated, but they had the ability to do that. They were one of the classes that could do satire. And there's just so many rules that they had to follow. I mean, the bardic rules are absolutely insane. One of the things that scholars like to complain about is that they don't really have the best rhyming schemes. They would do what's called jingling. They would jingle more than they would rhyme. So they might go like, they might say something like oh Suvni, he was so good, but then the Kruthni came, and neither of those two, Suvni nor Kruthni, are exact rhymes in Gaelic, but they would have been jingling. And so a lot of it is, some very odd meters with some very odd rhyming schemes. And they might have internal rhyming schemes. They might have internal meters that then break down as they go down through, because they have to use these divine epithets or these names, these topographical names, and they would just kind of mold it around that. Very much so, in my opinion, like song. It's mathematic, but there are some peculiarities to it. There's something that I wanted to, an interesting thing, a quote from a Scottish writer, a Scottish scholar from the 1700s, Martin. He said that the bards would shut their doors and windows for days at a time and lay in the dark with a stone upon their belly and their plaids up around their heads and eyes, and thus they pumped their brains for rhetorical ecumoniums, which is praise, rhetorical terms of praise. So it's very odd, the practices that they would have, but this was their life. This was a position, and a very noble position.
Well, very fascinating. I've always found just the idea of a court bard interesting, because it's not intuitive. You wouldn't think that someone who makes their profession about poetry would have the ear of kings, but that was the case in ancient Ireland. So
it really was. And one more thing before we move on from this. The bards, they lasted longer than a lot of other poetic traditions in Europe, and they eventually had, when the flight of the earls happened, when the Irish native earls fled from Ireland after some failed rebellions, some failed wars, the bards basically saw that the men who were paying them were gone, and they had no position. And so what they did was This is actually somewhat looked down upon. But the bards in their final hour were just writing to each other, basically dissing each other, basically saying like your knowledge of the ancient lore is not as good as mine, and your benefactor, your chieftain, he wasn't as good as my chieftain, and you were always wrong, and your meter is really bad, by the way. And so it's funny, they've lasted the longest, but through their own foolishness, once they lost their benefactor, they could do nothing but argue amongst themselves. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like on Twitter, we just have so many people squabbling at each other. Very reminiscent of that. So now I kind of wanted to shift gears and get into Indo-European history, more so than Celtic mythology. You have read the book The Aryan Household by William Edward Hearn. I did a book review on that well over a year ago. And I think that book is terrific because it gives a scholarly examination of the ancient Aryans and their religion. And although Hearn was a Christian, I believe, he treats it very respectfully. He doesn't try to proselytize his religion or just denigrate the ancient Aryans. So, could you explain the role of the household, the hearth, and the ancestor spirits?
Yeah, so the household would have been seen as a corporate body, is the way that Hearn describes it. And what he means by that is it's a union of different parts into a united whole. And so you would have had the physical home, the actual dwelling space itself. You would have had the environment that the home is existing on. And then you would have had the members of the home, including also the animals. The animals would have been like the cow, the horse, the dog, would have been tied to this. And at the center of this, the axis mundi of the home, would have been the hearth. And the hearth is where prior to modern civilization, the hearth would have been where the family would have gathered for meals in wintertime to get warmth. It's where you would have heard stories from your mother, from your father, from your grandparents. It was the anchor, the axis mundi. It was the center of their world, was the hearth. And the hearth fire itself was oftentimes relit from a communal fire, usually at a special site like Uppsala in Sweden would be a good example, or the Hill of Tara in Ireland would be another good example. And usually these would be done on special holidays, where you would have done, I think they call it ritual washing or ritual extinguishing, where you would put out the fire and then you'd relight it, and you would also cleanse yourself, and you would cleanse your household, you would cleanse your cattle, whatever, what have you. And the hearth would then be relit with this holy flame. And I don't remember exactly which era this is in, but in some eras of European histories, we would oftentimes, so I think they do this in Ireland especially, they would build their houses so that the rising sun or the setting sun would be cast into through the doorway, which is a liminal space. Doorways are a liminal space where spirits can cross over more easily. The sun would cast its rays through the doorway and it would strike the hearth. And sometimes this might be tied to equinoxes, solstices, but it would likely just be a general way of building your house. So there's definitely a connection there with the sun, the sun's fire, lighting the hearth. Moreover than this, you also have household gods, which would be tied to specific clans and families, but they are also spirits. House spirits is probably the more accurate way to view it, even though there were gods of the household. These house spirits would be, departed loved ones, your grandparents. In many parts of Europe and many points in time, if you weren't some rich man who could get buried in a barrow, you would oftentimes, be buried underneath your home, and this is what would give you property rights that your children would say, well, this is literally the land that my family is buried on. This is where my household is. And so these house spirits would be very, very important. It's similar to that concept, probably the same as that concept I said earlier of the genius loci, this like spirit that's tied to a specific place. And there's of course the land spirits of the land that the home is on, and they would also be genius loci, and they'd be seen very similarly to a house spirit. Yeah.
Very fascinating. You've written a lot about the ancient Aryans and just that general time period. It's not a time period that a lot of people study. Quite frankly, more people are interested in 20th century and modern history compared to stuff that's more ancient. But I think it is an important time period to study because that's where our race comes from. So, with that in mind, I'd like to ask you about your research process. How do you go about researching this time period? Because I know there aren't that many sources available.
Yeah, there aren't many sources available that's easy to find. I'll just kind of rattle off some resources for people though, because we are pretty lucky with the modern era. We have access to a lot. So when it comes to like books themselves, obviously William Edward Hearns is amazing. There's also another book by Coullains known as The Ancient City. Both of these books are amazing. They're must reads. You don't have to be pagan to appreciate them. You don't really even have to be that interested in the Bronze Age to appreciate them. They are just fundamental to European civilization, European law, European culture, and kind of how that develops. But you also have some pretty good YouTubers that I think should be mentioned. You have guys like Dan Davis History on YouTube. He sources every one of his videos. I've purchased a lot of academic books about the Bronze Age, such as the Oxford Guide to the Bronze Age Europe, or other books like the Bell Beakers. The Phenomenon of the Bell Beakers is a pretty good little academic book. And there's just so many sources that Dan Davis puts in his videos. So I highly suggest people check out Dan Davis and go through his sources. He also writes fiction about the Bronze Age, and it's very well researched, very good. He definitely understands what he's talking about. And his videos are really fascinating as well because he will go into a specific culture and everything that we know about that culture. So his videos are incredibly informative. Another great example would probably be Tom Rousel. Although he doesn't always put his sources in his description, he sometimes will. And he has a really great channel called Jive Talk, where when a new genetic study comes out or something of that nature, he will go over it. And that's really important because the archaeogenetics are, one of the main sources that we're going to have beyond from anthropology and linguistics. But there's a lot of books that these two guys will quote from that kind of just are missed by a lot of people. There's this great book by, I can never pronounce his name, Kaiswer Sereth. It's called like The Ancestral Way. I'm not sure exactly. I can't exactly remember the name of that one, but that one was suggested to me by Witten or Speckinger Sivan Harrell of the Austria Folk Assembly, and that one it goes into the reconstructed pantheon of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. It's a very good book to read if you want to learn more about the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And there's also a really great. I don't know exactly how to say it. There's a great series of papers that you can find on academia. If you go to academia and you type in European Bronze Age, and then you look specifically for papers by scholars such as like David Reich, or there's many. John Carey is a good one for the Celts. Those sorts of papers are really where the bread and butter is going to be. It's great to read academic books. It's great to read, these more scholarly texts. But it's also good to just go and read the papers that these books are oftentimes citing from. And if you ever get a book like the Oxford Guide to the Bronze Age, the citations will just give you tons and tons of hints. So when I do my research, I'm mostly, my process has mostly been me hearing about a book or seeing a book in the sources under Dan Davis, Tom Rousel, or Genos Historia is a third one. He mostly covers genetics though, and he's just not as prolific as these other two, but he's still very good. And I'll find this source, I'll find this book or this paper, and then I'll just go track it down and read it. And so that's my process mostly.
I can definitely attest to that. One of the best ways to find sources is to mine the bibliographies of people you currently read. So if there's a base YouTuber or a based author you like, check their bibliography and then go purchase those books, and that'll give you more than enough resources to start with.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, let's talk about how we can teach the history of the Bronze Age and the ancient Aryans to people in the modern day. It's very difficult to get people interested in this, and there's a lot of ambiguity and misconceptions about this time period. So, how should we, not just as Asatruar, but also just as white people who are interested in our history, how should we go about teaching this era of history?
I think that there's a few different ways. Obviously, multimedia is a great resource. Videos is a great resource. Tom Rousel has done a great job, kind of revitalizing this study amongst the heathens specifically, but also some non-heathens. And so video documentaries are a great thing. Podcasts such as this is very useful. But I every week my kindred with the AFA, myself and my Gothi John Rock, we will give lectures, and these lectures are they're not like strictly like collegiate or like supposed to be like academic or something. They're very laissez-faire, very laid back lectures, and usually what we're doing is we'll start off with some etymology. We'll start off with some proto myth, some myth, some proto form, some archetype, and then we will go through, after explaining the language, we'll go through and come to a concept or a god or a specific mythological element, a mythopoetic. And once we highlight that, then we will then compare that to what the Celts had, what the Germans had, what the Romans had. And once you kind of have a full understanding of the language that's being used, because it's very archaic language. Proto-Indo-European is many, many steps removed from us. And even Proto-German or Proto-Celtic is very removed from us. So if you can go through the language and then highlight upon a English concept, a concept that we know in English, or a concept that's common within heathenism or traditionalism, then you can compare that to things that people probably already have an idea about. One of the greatest things is this household thing. If you're able to explain the language of the household, and then really draw attention to the fact that that's how the paterfamilias, that's how the Roman families, that's how they would have operated the empire. It was done underneath this household cult. That's a really key element that people miss. And once you're able to explain that, people no longer miss it. It becomes implicitly understood or explicitly understood. And I think that another good one is music and poetry. Music would probably be a little bit better because it's more accessible than poetry. But most good music just has poetry in it. So, and most good poetry is just music. But the music would be a really good one. There's musicians like Huraith. She's pretty cool. There's obviously people know about people like Hell. Forgetting some of those names. Wardruna. There's so many of these neo folk bands. But a lot of that stuff has gotten people interested in this. Even like black metal has gotten people somewhat interested in this, or power metal, has gotten people somewhat interested in medieval history. So, I can imagine a day where there's going to be power metal about the Bronze Age. That'll be pretty cool, and it will undoubtedly sound different than the power metal of the medieval era. So yeah, music, media, lectures. I think those things would be good. Also, artwork. Christian Sloane Hall is a amazing artist, and he does a lot of Bronze Age artwork. I think he's a Scotsman, but he might just be British, Scottish, and English ancestry. But he does a lot of paintings about the Bronze Age. You can go and purchase his prints online. I highly suggest it if you want some really based artwork about the Bronze Age. And he's also been doing artwork for Restore Britain, the political party there in Britain. So Christian Sloane Hall is definitely showing a good example of how artwork can also impart this on people. I've seen one of his art is of two Santashta Indo-Aryan men on a chariot riding over a brown Dravidian Indian, and that picture has been memed a million times, and that's because of him. There's also the more poorly drawn memes of like the Chad pastoralist Aryan with the milk, and he's like mogging some farmer guy. Stuff like that is also important.
I really do think we just need to create more because there's not a lot of volume out there. But you're right, artwork is important, music is important, and if we just created more of this, I think just the volume would speak wonders. You can even create memes if you want. I know the meme of Agartha with the Chud Jack went viral a while ago. Not really educational, but it is kind of funny. But if you're more artistically inclined, you could do something like there's this Twitter account called Arthurian Aesthetics. And I think it just invokes something in the soul of anyone with English ancestry, but more broadly, anyone who's white, because the artwork just speaks to you. Another example is if anyone's familiar with the band Nox Arcana, they have some really fantastic artwork for their album covers. I don't know if they're politically aligned with us, but their music still speaks to the soul regardless. And even a game like Skyrim, it also speaks to that soul that we all have in a way that other races can't understand. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, memes are not as educational, of course, but that's the first interaction that some secular or normie conservative is going to come in contact with a lot of our ideas, is usually going to be through some esoteric meme about Hyperborea or Gartha or Atlantis. And oftentimes all those things are drawn right on the Bronze Age. And beyond from that, I there's this meme of the milk drinking pastoralist Chad, Aryan Chad, and he's mogging some farmer. I see that meme all the time, and it's become so widespread that like not necessarily even just the artwork of the meme, but the idea of Europeans being lactose tolerant. That's something that now is very well. It's obviously that's this scientific knowledge that we have, but it's now ingrained in the minds of a lot of normie people because they see these memes that we've been putting out. So the memes are really important at getting people interested and just breaking that first barrier. And yeah, Skyrim as well. Really Elder Scrolls is a good example of something that can draw people closer to European mythology.
Fantastic. So now we get to the point where I ask every guest this question. What does it mean to be a hero?
Um, that's a really good question. I think that a hero is someone who there's different layers to a hero. So on one hand, I think that like the highest layer of a hero is someone who is semi-divine or they're being deified. They've done such amazing deeds for their folk, for their people. family, for their clan, for their nation, or for the civilization itself, that they have achieved a level of divinity. Now, whether that means that they were divinely inspired, whether that means they are literally semi-divine demigods, or if they're just being deified after their death, it can be any one of those things. And to me, that would be the quote unquote true hero, someone who, has achieved something so great that they're now godlike. And I think that that would be the kind of baseline judgment for that. But there's other layers too. In the Christian religion, we have martyrs, and a martyr is kind of like a hero for Christians because he's doing the thing that he's meant to do. He's dying for his religion. But for Indo-Europeans, for pagans, definitely the hero is our version of the martyr, because this is someone who is doing the thing. They're literally doing the act of heroism. I think that in the original Greek, I think that the term itself does refer to a demigod, but I might be wrong. Just could be someone of great strength or divine ancestry or something. But I know that the etymology of hero is tied to the Proto-Indo-European root. I think you pronounce it "sir," meaning to protect. And so a hero is someone who protects their people, protects their clan, protects their family, protects their nation. And there's heroines as well. There's female heroes, so it's not just a male domain. But it's definitely a there's layers to it. At the lowest level, your father could be your hero because he protects you and provides for you, and he's a good man and teaches you and all of those things. But then at the highest spiritual level, you have someone who's of divine connection somehow.
For sure. And I would just like to add on to that. I think agency is very important when we're talking about the hero, because a hero is agentic. He does not resign himself to immutable fate. He or she believes in their own agency and uses it to influence the world around them. And I think there's something powerful about that. In the modern day, it's so easy to get beat down and demoralized, but agency is the antidote to demoralization. You can quote me on that. And I think that's very important for a hero. And also, I think a hero is judged by the quality of his or her opposition. So any fictional example you look to, the greater or the more dangerous the villain is, it makes the hero's accomplishments all the more inspiring. You can look at someone like Sanguinius from 40K for that. So what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. I love that quote too. I want to use it now and write an article all about that
Oh, feel
specific
free to
idea.
steal it.
Yeah, and I will, and I'll properly source you. But yeah, I think that you are right that a good litmus test or a good way to kind of gauge the hero is who is his villain, who is his nemesis, what is he fighting against. I think that that's very true. I mean, an interesting one to kind of point to might be Arminius. Herman, the German Arminius. He's taken up by the Romans, and he fights with the Romans, and he learns civilization from them. He learns of the civic duties and the civic polity, and then he goes to his people, the Germans, and he fights for them. He frees them from Roman occupation, and betrays the Romans and brings that civic polity to the Germans. That's very interesting that he's fighting against the Roman civilization, but then he in the process of doing so, he further establishes the Germanic civilization. So there's definitely something there about the the quality or the whatever the villain is that the hero is going up against is probably going to define the hero quite a lot.
And just to wrap up on that, in the modern day, we have villains who are of the tribe in desert New Jersey. You could say, I'm just going to be careful because I'm on YouTube. they're promoting all of this degeneracy in our society. And so when we triumph over them, it'll be all the more inspiring for the generations that come after us. So, Aodhan, this has been a fantastic conversation. But before we get to shilling, are there any other topics you'd like to talk about? I always like to give the last 5 minutes for the guests to bring up any topics that we may have overlooked or that they specifically want to get to before the shilling, of course. So, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things from earlier to touch on. I mentioned how the Celts have a tripartite system, and that these tripartites, it is an Indo-European root that all of this is coming from, but the tripartite system was really, really established in the Celtic world. You see this with the world tree that they have. There's like 3 parts to it and 3 different trees even. But you also see it with the soul complex, which is depicted with 3 cauldrons. And these 3 cauldrons, I don't want to say that this is what the symbol is, because it's actually very, very ancient. It's from the Neolithic. But there's those 3 swirling symbols that kind of meet and come together. Sometimes they're depicted as a triskelion, which is like a 3-part, 3-prong version of the swastika. But there's also just there's just a different one. It's just these 3 swirls coming together. And that's not Celtic in origin, that specific symbol that shows up on ancient Neolithic barrows from Spain to Ireland. But it is very reminiscent to me of the 3 cauldrons, and the 3 cauldrons of the Celtic soul complex. They're called the 3 cauldrons of Posey, and it's from a poem that's attributed to the poet Avergan, who's this great poet, as I mentioned before. And some people like to connect them to the Indo-Aryan chakra system, which I think is probably true. I know that Stephen McNallen has written about this a little bit, about how the Celtic cauldrons are tied to the Indo-Aryan chakras. It's probably very true, but they're also tied to well springs, which are very important in the Celtic world. A liminal, overflowing, a liminal place where there's an overflowing of energy, of soul energy, of spirit. And there's 3 cauldrons. There's the Gordiev, which is the cauldron of warming, and it's usually located in the belly, I believe. And this is always upright. It's always full and upright. Is at birth. It can change throughout your life. And there's the Cor Ernma, which is the cauldron of vocation, which is usually located in the center of your chest, in your heart. And this one is usually on its side, or maybe even inverted. And it can come upright through life experiences. It can become upright through different things that happen to you, like the death of a loved one, or an adventure, or being healthy or unhealthy. There's all sorts of ways that the cord enma, the vocation, can change. And then there's also the cord source, which is the cauldron of wisdom. And this one is usually located in the head or the brain. And actually, the Celts, they had a head cult of the head, which was because they thought that the soul resided in the head, that it was the seat of the soul itself. So you might call this cauldron the true soul. And that's why they had a head hunting cult. They would cut the heads off their enemies and collect them like trophies, usually putting them maybe above their doorway at their home, or there's all sorts of things that they do with the heads of their enemies. And it was actually pretty honorable if a Celt felt that you were important enough to keep your head. It was a pretty honorable thing, from his perspective. But he definitely was doing it because that it was all a little disrespectful at the same time. You're both showing honor to this man because you're saying that he's an honorable enemy. He's a worthwhile enemy. That having your head is a good trophy, but it's also a little disrespectful because he's holding on to the seat of your soul. And there's other elements of this tripartite soul complex, which I find to be really interesting, which is the fact that the quote. There's a quote from Avergan in his poem, The Three Cauldrons Symposium, where he basically says the gods do not apportion equal portions to each cauldron, to each person. Every person has the cauldrons are situated differently, and they're filled differently. And this really goes in to show that there is a soul hierarchy. There is a genetic, metagenetic hierarchy, and that's why there's classes of people. That's why there's a hierarchy of people. It's tied to your soul. Your soul has a certain quality to it because the gods have allowed it to be that way, and your life and your actions have affected that. And that's just something that I wanted to touch on here at the end, is their concept of the soul, and also to mention that they did believe in reincarnation, and it probably would have been tied to the cauldron of wisdom. It was probably that was the one that was being incarnated over and over again.
Very well put. That's a fantastic way to end this podcast. So now for Schilling, you obviously have some books that you've written. I highly recommend them, and you have your Substack. So where can people find you and buy your resources?
So I have a poetry collection and a collection of my essays for sale on Amazon called For Hearth and Home. You can get it pretty cheap there. I also have all of that stuff and much more on my Substack, which is called the Enchiridion. You can also find it under folkism.substack. I also recently, started up YouTube. Although there's no videos posted, there is a playlist with all of the other podcasts that I've appeared on. That's YouTube is called Radio Agartha, and yeah, I was really glad that you were able to do this, and I've enjoyed chatting with you about Celtic mythology. And yeah, I hope that you have great success going into the future. And thank you again for having me on.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I wish the best for you as well. So long, everybody. I'll try to make more content regularly now that I'm a lot healthier than I was. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.